Caleb Mercer didn't leave the VA hospital so much as he was released from it, the kind of release that feels like paperwork deciding you're no longer an emergency. Durango, Colorado, sat under a hard, late-winter sky. The mountains to the north stacked in blue layers like bruises, their ridgelines sharp against the pale light. The air was thin and metallic, the sort of cold that doesn't just bite exposed skin but reaches for your joints. Wind slid off the Animas River corridor and pushed through downtown streets, rattling signs and carrying the smell of wood smoke from chimneys that belonged to people with addresses. Snow from the night before lay in crusted patches along the sidewalks, refrozen into dirty plates by morning traffic. March here could be generous for an hour and cruel for a week. Today, it leaned toward cruel. Caleb walked with the practiced economy of a man who had learned to save motion. 41, a shade under 6 feet, broad through the shoulders in a way that came from years of carrying weight rather than lifting for show. His hair was dark and kept short, as if long hair were a luxury he didn't trust. A narrow scar ran from the edge of his left eyebrow into his hairline, faded but still visible when the light hit at the right angle. He hadn't shaved in 3 days. The stubble didn't soften his face. It only emphasized the hard planes of his cheekbones and the set of his jaw, the kind of jaw that looked like it had learned to hold back words before they could become mistakes. His eyes were gray-green, alert in a way that didn't read as confidence so much as constant assessment. He wore a weathered olive jacket with a high collar, a dark beanie pulled low, and jeans that had the faint abrasive shine of being worn too often without the luxury of replacement. On his right shoulder strap hung a canvas pack, not a big one, just enough to prove he wasn't going home. A folded topo map rode in the side pocket, its edges softened by handling. A hunting knife, legal length, sat clipped inside his waistband because habits didn't dissolve just because you were handed a discharge form. Beside him moved Rex. Rex was a Belgian Malinois, 9 years old by the paperwork, though Caleb suspected the dog's internal clock ran a little faster than any veterinarian's estimate. The Malinois' coat was fawn with a black mask, the muzzle flecked now with a peppering of gray that made him look older than he acted. His ears were still sharp and upright, but the left one carried a thin notch near the tip, a souvenir from a doorway in Kandahar and a piece of shrapnel that had missed the eye by inches. Rex's build was lean and dense, spring-loaded muscle under tight skin, yet the slightest stiffness showed when he pivoted too quickly on ice. His eyes were dark amber, intelligent and uncomfortably attentive, as if he were always reading the room for what it might do next. He wore a simple working harness, black nylon with scuffed hardware, and a short lead that Caleb held loosely. Rex didn't pull. He rarely needed to. He stayed half a step ahead, not out of disobedience, but out of purpose, scanning the world with a discipline that matched Caleb's own. People looked at them. They always did. Some faces held curiosity. Some held the quick discomfort of someone who didn't know whether to thank you for your service or pretend you weren't there. A young couple in puffy jackets paused near a coffee shop window, their conversation fading when Rex's paws clicked across the icy concrete. A man in a work vest stared too long, then glanced away as if caught. Caleb felt it all without reacting. In the Army, he'd learned the difference between attention that meant danger and attention that was just noise. Back here, most of it was noise, but he couldn't stop his body from cataloging it anyway. He passed the bus stop where he'd sat the night he'd first arrived in town, waiting for a ride to the VA, trying not to shake in front of strangers. He passed a thrift store, a pawn shop, a shuttered storefront with paper taped to the inside of the glass. And he did not pass a home, because he didn't have one. The last apartment he'd tried to keep had become a math problem he couldn't solve. Rent versus medication, rent versus dog food, rent versus the slow leak of money into things people assumed you could just handle if you were resourceful. Resourceful was another word for abandoned, dressed up to sound like a compliment. Caleb stopped once, outside a hardware store, not to go in but to watch the flag snapping above the entrance. The wind made it sound like cloth being slapped against a wall. He watched it long enough to feel the old reflex rise, stand a little straighter, a little more aware, and then let it pass. Rex sat without being told, eyes on Caleb's face, and Caleb's hand found the top of the dog's head, pressing gently between the ears in a slow grounding motion. Rex's tail didn't wag. It didn't need to. He leaned into the touch like a promise. The decision to leave town had formed quietly, without drama, over months of sleepless nights and half-finished job applications and the thin, bright taste of antiseptic hallways. Caleb had done everything he was supposed to do. He'd taken the appointments, swallowed the pills, listened to the polite language that tried to turn trauma into manageable bullet points. He'd nodded at counselors who meant well, but couldn't see past their protocols. And when the hours got long and the walls started to feel too close, he'd done what he had always done when the world became too loud. He'd gone looking for space. That space was on paper in his pack, a topo map from a county archive, bought for a few dollars and a skeptical look from the clerk. It showed an old mining region tucked into the folds of the San Juan backcountry, a scatter of abandoned claims in a thin line where a trail once ran before the Forest Service stopped maintaining it. The map was from the late 1940s, before satellite imagery, before the tidy confidence of modern lines. On one corner of the sheet, someone had penciled a note in faded graphite, "Warm seep?" with a question mark that looked like it had been drawn by a hand not entirely sober or not entirely certain. Caleb had stared at that question mark for a long time. Warm seep. In these mountains, warmth meant survival. In these mountains, warmth also meant danger, thin crusts over scalding water, unstable ground, the kind of places that killed the careless without making a sound. Caleb knew the stories. Tourists at Yellowstone stepping off boardwalks, hunters losing dogs to hidden pools. But this wasn't Yellowstone. This was a blank spot in a county map, a place the world had forgotten to name. He had waited until Rex's vet cleared them for longer travel. He had traded his last steady paycheck, 2 weeks at a construction site, into supplies that would fit on his back: a compact hatchet, a coil of paracord, a cheap tarp, a metal cup, a few packs of jerky and oatmeal, water purification tablets, and a small first aid kit that he built up like a ritual. He didn't pack sentimental things. Sentiment was heavy. Now, walking out of Durango with the mountains ahead, he felt something close to relief under the weight of his gear. The city sounds thinned behind him, engines, distant voices, the cough of a snowplow. The road angled upward, houses grew sparse. The wind strengthened as if the mountains were breathing it out. Rex paused at the edge of a trailhead sign half buried in snow. He lifted his nose, tasting the air. Caleb watched him the way he'd watched him overseas, trusting the dog's senses more than his own thoughts. Rex's posture changed slightly, a subtle tightening through the shoulders that meant interest, not fear. He glanced back once, making brief eye contact, then looked forward again. That was Rex's way of saying, "This direction makes sense." Caleb stepped into the trees. The first mile was deceptive. The trail was packed by a few hikers and hunters, the snow shallow enough to crunch under boots. Pines stood dark and still, their branches bowing under white weight. The cold had a clarity to it. Each breath felt like it carved a clean line through his chest. He found his rhythm. Step, breath, listen, step, breath, scan. Rex moved ahead, paws light, choosing the firmest ground. Caleb's joints warmed from movement, but his fingers stayed numb inside his gloves. The sky brightened without warming. Overhead, clouds drifted like dirty wool. By midday, the packed trail ended. The snow deepened, swallowing his shins, then his knees. The world grew quiet in the way it does when snow is thick, sound dampened, distance shortened, everything reduced to the immediate. Caleb adjusted his pack straps and kept going. He had learned long ago that the body complains early and adapts later. He had also learned that quitting mid-slope was worse than pushing through. As the afternoon stretched, he saw the first sign that the map might not be a lie, a faint thinning in the snow cover along a low bend between two ridges. The white there looked different, less uniform, less hard. Rex reached it first, sniffed, and then did something that made Caleb stop cold. The dog pawed at the snow once, twice, and a wisp of steam curled up like a ghost exhaling. Caleb stared. It wasn't dramatic. No geyser, no roaring column of vapor, just a thin breath of warmth rising from the ground in a place that should have been locked in ice. The sight hit him in the chest harder than he expected, not because it was beautiful, but because it was real. A resource, a possibility, the kind of thing that didn't care about his file number or his diagnosis codes. Rex looked back at him again, ears forward, eyes bright with purpose. Caleb swallowed, on tasting cold air and something faintly mineral underneath it. His mouth went dry anyway. "All right," he said, voice rough from disuse. "Show me." And together they followed the weak thread of warmth uphill, away from the last hints of human tracks, toward whatever waited beyond the ridge, toward a place that might be nothing, or might be the first honest shelter Caleb Mercer had ever found. Caleb followed the thin ribbon of steam as if it were a trail left deliberately for him, the air changing subtly with each step upward. The forest thinned, pines giving way to scrub and exposed rock, and the wind that had worried at his collar since morning fell away as if shut out by an unseen wall. Snow still lay thick on the surrounding slopes, but here it softened underfoot, compressing instead of cracking, releasing a faint mineral scent that reminded him of wet stone and old iron. Rex moved ahead with careful confidence, testing the ground with quick, precise steps, then pausing to look back whenever the surface changed. Caleb trusted that pause. He had learned years ago and far from home that a dog's hesitation was information, not fear. The ridge opened into a narrow bowl no more than a few hundred yards across. Uncupped by stone on three sides, steam rose in uneven breaths from scattered points along the valley floor, never enough to obscure vision, just enough to make the place feel alive. Caleb crouched and pressed his bare palm to a patch of exposed earth where the snow had retreated. The soil was dark and damp, warm in a way that sank into his skin instead of scalding it. He pulled his hand back slowly, heart thudding not with panic but with calculation. Warm ground in March at this elevation meant a steady source, not a fluke. It meant the earth here was bleeding heat all the time, quietly, without ceremony. Rex circled, nose low, tail level, mapping the valley with a seriousness that mirrored Caleb's own. The dog's breath fogged the air, but his posture was relaxed, ears forward, curiosity outweighing caution. He stopped at a shallow runnel where water slipped out of the rock and traced a lazy path through the center of the bowl. Caleb knelt again and dipped 2 fingers into the stream. The water was hot enough to make him hiss, not boiling, but close. He withdrew his hand and watched the steam curl up, then followed the flow downstream with his eyes until it cooled, the vapor thinning where the channel widened and the water met snow. Temperature gradient, he thought. Zones. The word settled into place with the comfort of an old tool fitting a familiar grip. He took his pack off and set it on a flat stone, then stood still for a long moment, listening. No engines, no voices, only the low whisper of moving water and the soft exhale of steam meeting cold air. The place felt hidden without being claustrophobic, protected without being trapped. Caleb walked the perimeter, counting steps, gauging slopes, noting where rock outcrops could break wind and where the ground looked treacherous, thin crusts that might collapse into scalding pockets beneath. He broke a branch and used it to probe ahead, the habit automatic, the motion steady. When the stick punched through snow into a hollow with a dull, wet sound, he marked it with a strip of torn fabric from his pack strap. He would remember where not to step. By late afternoon, light slanted low and pale across the bowl. Caleb chose a site on the southern edge, far enough from the hottest vents to be safe, close enough to feel the radiating warmth. He stamped down snow, laid the tarp as a ground sheet, and stacked stones to anchor the corners. He worked without hurry, each movement deliberate, conserving energy. Rex lay down nearby, a chin on paws, watching with an expression that looked like approval. When Caleb finished, he sat back on his heels and exhaled, feeling the fatigue settle into his muscles in a clean, honest way that had nothing to do with anxiety. As the temperature dropped outside the bowl, the valley held. Steam thickened, then thinned again as the air shifted, and the stream continued its patient run. Caleb cooked oatmeal over a small stove, the flame a pale blue whisper, and added a pinch of salt he'd saved for when food needed to feel like more than fuel. He ate slowly, looking out at the steam and the rock and the pockets of bare earth that defied the season. He thought of the map, the penciled question mark, and wondered about the hand that had written it. A miner, a surveyor, someone who had seen this warmth and moved on anyway, bound to a different plan. The thought didn't make him angry. It made him careful. Night came without ceremony. The stars cut through the cold sky above the ridge, sharp and numerous. Inside the bowl, the air stayed soft. Caleb lay on his side, jacket zipped to his chin, and listened to Rex settle in beside him. The dog's flank rose and fell, steady, and Caleb matched his breathing to it without thinking. Sleep came quickly, deep and untroubled, the kind that didn't require defense. He dreamed, but the dreams were ordinary. Tools laid out on a bench, water running over stone, a map unfolding to reveal a path that made sense. He woke before dawn to movement. Not threat, Rex would have told him, but change. Steam drifted low across the ground, catching the first light and breaking it into pale colors that made the bowl look briefly unreal. Caleb sat up and rubbed his face, then laughed once under his breath, a short sound he hadn't made in years. He stood and walked the valley again, this time with a notebook in hand, sketching rough shapes, marking vents, tracing the stream. He tested temperatures with the metal cup, timing how long it took for water to cool as it traveled, noting where frost retreated earliest. Each observation anchored the place more firmly in reality. This wasn't luck. It was physics, geology, patience. As the sun climbed, a new sound reached him, distant, irregular, the unmistakable rhythm of hooves on frozen ground. Rex's head snapped up, ears pricked, body coiling. Caleb stilled him with a touch and waited. The sound grew, then resolved into a single horse, picking its way along the ridge above the bowl. A rider came into view, silhouetted briefly against the pale sky before descending. The man was middle-aged, tall in the saddle, with a long, weathered face and a beard gone mostly gray. He wore a battered felt hat pulled low and a coat patched at the elbows. His posture suggested habit rather than ease, a man accustomed to long days and few surprises. He reined in at the edge of the bowl, eyes narrowing as he took in the steam and the bare ground. "Didn't think anyone was down here this time of year," the man called, voice carrying without effort. It held caution, not accusation. Caleb stood where he was, hands visible, body relaxed but ready. "Didn't think anyone came this way anymore," he replied. The rider dismounted with the practiced stiffness of someone whose joints remembered decades of cold. He led the horse closer, stopping short of the steam vents. Up close, his eyes were pale and sharp, his expression reserved. He introduced himself as Tom Alvarez, a local who checked fence lines and wintered cattle on the margins when weather allowed. He didn't smile, but he didn't scowl either. He looked at Rex with interest, then at Caleb with a different kind of assessment. "Ground's tricky," Tom said, nodding toward the steam. "People used to avoid it. Lost a mule here once, long time back." Caleb acknowledged the warning and offered nothing more than that he knew the risks. Tom studied him a moment longer, then shrugged. "Just thought I'd say it," he said. "Place keeps its own rules." He mounted again, paused, and added, "Storm's coming tomorrow night. Hard one by the look of the sky." Then he turned his horse and rode on, the sound of hooves fading back into the cold. And Caleb watched until the ridge swallowed him, then returned to his notes. A storm would test the bowl. It would test him. He felt no urge to leave. If anything, the warning settled his resolve. He had found a place that could hold heat against the cold, a place that refused to freeze simply because the calendar said it should. As the light strengthened and the steam thinned, Caleb closed his notebook and looked at Rex, who stood alert at his side, tail still. "We'll see," Caleb said quietly, and began to plan. The storm arrived on the second night, not with drama, but with certainty, the kind that announces itself hours in advance if you know how to listen. By late afternoon, the air inside the bowl thickened, pressing low against the skin, and the light dulled as if someone had turned a dimmer switch on the sky. Clouds stacked over the ridge in dense, bruised layers. The steam vents breathed harder, their pale plumes pulled sideways by a wind that had not yet found its way down into the valley. Caleb took the warning seriously. He had learned the hard way that storms did not need to be impressive to be lethal. They only needed time. He tightened every line of the tarp, added stones to the anchors, and dug a shallow trench around the sleeping area to guide runoff away from the ground sheet. He repositioned his pack on a flat rock where it would stay dry and reachable. Rex followed him closely, reading his movements with the fluency of long practice, occasionally stopping to sniff the air or the ground as if checking the same calculations by different means. The dog's ears angled forward, alert but not anxious. His tail remained level, a sign that he was ready to work. Caleb moved to the stream and adjusted a few stones he'd placed earlier, redirecting the hottest flow away from the campsite and toward a low channel where the water could cool before spreading. He tested the temperature with the metal cup again, feeling the heat through the handle, then marked a new boundary in his notebook. He didn't romanticize the warmth. He treated it like any other power source, useful, dangerous if misjudged, deserving of respect. As dusk fell, the wind finally spilled over the ridge and into the bowl. Snow followed, dry at first, then heavy, the flakes thickening until the world beyond the circle of warmth dissolved into white. The valley responded in subtle ways. Steam thickened near the vents, then flattened as gusts tore at it. The stream swelled, its surface breaking into ripples that carried heat outward. Caleb crouched and watched, counting seconds between gusts, feeling the rhythm settle into something he could anticipate. He fed the stove sparingly, cooking a simple meal, conserving fuel. When he finished, he shut the flame down and let the earth do the rest. Night brought noise, wind rattled stones, snow hissed across exposed rock. The tarp snapped once, then held. Rex lay pressed against Caleb's side, his body a compact heat source, the muscles taut but steady. The dog's breathing changed when the first heavy gust hit, quickening for a moment, then slowing as he adjusted. Caleb rested a hand on Rex's shoulder, feeling the familiar density there, the calm that came from shared drills and shared danger. Outside the bowl, the storm roared. Inside, the air stayed soft enough to breathe without pain. Sometime after midnight, a different sound cut through the wind, a crack like a rifle shot, sharp and close. Caleb was awake instantly, heart spiking, body already moving. He grabbed the headlamp and swept the beam across the slope above the campsite. Snow slid in a shallow sheet, stopping short of the warm ground where it thinned and collapsed into steam. A small release, not an avalanche, but enough to confirm what he'd suspected. The bowl was sheltered, not immune. He adjusted the tarp again, then waited until the wind eased before lying back down. Sleep came in fragments after that, but it came. By morning, the storm had spent itself. The sky cleared in stages, blue bleeding through gray, light returning in cautious increments. The bowl looked transformed. Snow lay deep beyond the warm margins, sculpted into soft drifts against rock. Inside the heat, the ground steamed steadily, untouched by the night's work. Caleb rose stiffly, checked his hands and feet, and then smiled despite himself. The place had held. He spent the morning repairing what little the storm had loosened and refining his marks. He expanded the safe zone by probing methodically, mapping thin crusts and firm ground, learning where heat pooled and where it dispersed. He sketched a rough plan for a more permanent shelter, half buried into the slope where stone could provide structure and the earth could provide insulation. The idea didn't feel like ambition so much as necessity. Temporary solutions were fine for nights, they failed over seasons. Near midday, Rex stiffened and angled his body toward the north edge of the bowl. Caleb followed his gaze and saw movement where snow met steam. A mule deer stepped into view, her coat thick and gray-brown, ribs faintly visible beneath winter fur. She paused, head high, nostrils flaring as she tested the air. Her eyes were dark and wary, the look of an animal that survived by choosing caution over curiosity. Caleb froze, lowering his center of gravity, making himself small. He had no interest in startling her into bolting across thin ground. The deer took a tentative step, then another, a hooves finding purchase where the snow softened. She lowered her head and nosed at the exposed earth, scraping lightly, then lifted it again as if surprised by what she found. Heat drew her closer despite her instincts. Rex remained still, disciplined, his gaze locked but his body calm. Caleb murmured a low, steady sound he'd used overseas to keep Rex grounded around civilians. The dog's ears flicked, then settled. The deer drank from a cooler stretch of the stream, steam curling around her legs. For a few minutes, the three of them shared the space without conflict, a temporary truce enforced by necessity. Then, a gust of wind carried a new scent. The deer's head snapped up. She bounded back toward the trees, clearing the warm margin in two powerful leaps and vanished into snow. Caleb let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The valley was not just shelter, it was a resource, and resources attracted life. That meant opportunity. It also meant responsibility. The afternoon passed in steady work. Caleb split deadfall with the hatchet, stacking wood where it would dry in the warmth without becoming brittle. He experimented with a small pit dug into the slope, lining it with stones warmed by the stream and covering it with earth. When he lifted the covering hours later, the space beneath held heat like a cupped hand. He nodded to himself and made another note. He could build here. Slowly. Correctly. Late in the day, sound reached him again from the ridge. Hooves, but this time closer and more deliberate. Tom Alvarez appeared at the edge of the bowl, his horse blowing softly, nostrils flared. Tom dismounted and surveyed the scene with narrowed eyes, taking in the intact shelter, the marked ground, the way the steam behaved after the storm. He looked at Caleb differently now, not as a curiosity but as a man who had earned the right to be where he stood. "You stayed," Tom said. It wasn't a question. "I did," Caleb replied. Tom nodded once. He scratched his beard, the gesture thoughtful rather than nervous. "Storm hit harder up high," he said. "Lost a fence line. Didn't lose stock. This place helps." He hesitated, then added, "You plan to be here a while?" Caleb considered the question carefully. "Long enough to do it right," he said. Tom studied him another moment, then glanced at Rex. "Dog steady," he said. "Means you are too." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Coffee," he said gruffly, offering it without ceremony. "For after storms." He didn't wait for thanks. He mounted again and rode off, leaving hoofprints that filled with steam and vanished. As evening approached, Caleb brewed the coffee over the stove, the smell sharp and grounding. He drank it slowly, watching steam lift from the earth as the temperature dropped beyond the bowl. The storm had tested the place and him, and neither had failed. He closed his notebook and added a final line beneath the day's notes. "Shelter proven. Zones stable. Begin building." Rex settled at his side, eyes half closed, content. Caleb rested a hand on the dog's neck and looked out across the valley, already seeing lines where walls might rise and pathways might run. The ground here refused to freeze, and for the first time in a long while, so did his resolve. The work began the morning after the storm, not with grand gestures, but with choices made small enough to be corrected. Caleb stood at the southern edge of the bowl with his notebook open and the pencil held loosely between his fingers, watching how steam slid across the ground as the sun climbed. Heat moved like a living thing here, pooling where stone cradled it, thinning where the slope broke. He marked the lines again, then tore the page out and folded it into his pocket. Plans on paper were useful. Plans in the body mattered more. He started by cutting into the slope where the ground held firm, shaving earth away with the short shovel until a shallow shelf emerged. The soil came up dark and warm, clumping instead of crumbling, and the smell of it, mineral, old, settled into his clothes. He worked slowly, checking each cut, just listening for the change in sound that meant hollow space beneath. Rex stayed close, repositioning himself whenever the shovel angle changed, eyes flicking between Caleb's hands and the ground ahead. The dog's discipline had softened with age, but his instincts were sharp as ever. He knew when to be still and when to warn. By midday, the shelf was deep enough to take stone. Caleb hauled rocks from the valley edge, choosing those with flat faces and fractures that suggested they'd stack clean. He set them without mortar, fitting weight to weight, letting gravity do the work. It was a method he'd learned in pieces, watching old men build walls in places where materials were scarce and time was expensive. The wall rose knee-high, then waist-high, each course leaning slightly into the slope so the earth could brace it. He paused often, or rolling his shoulders, flexing his fingers. The ache was honest. It didn't drag him backward into memories. It kept him present. As afternoon thinned toward evening, he capped the wall with heavier stones and stepped back. The shape suggested a room rather than a hole, a place that could be closed in without sealing the heat away. He tested the air with his palm, feeling warmth push gently against his skin. Good. He pulled the tarp up temporarily, stretching it across the opening to hold heat through the night, then weighted it down. The shelter was crude, but it marked a shift from passing through to staying. That night he slept deeper than he had since arriving, the steady warmth easing his joints and quieting the background hum in his head. When he woke, he didn't reach immediately for the knife. He listened instead, registering the stream's murmur, the low exhale of steam, the soft scrape of Rex repositioning himself. Morning arrived without urgency. He spent the next days building rhythm. Mornings were for heavy work while the air stayed cool, expanding the stone wall, cutting notches into fallen timber, shaping beams that would frame the opening. Afternoons were for testing and adjustment, diverting the stream a few inches here, laying stone channels there to bleed off heat so it warmed the shelter evenly instead of spiking. Evenings were for notes, meals, and quiet. Rex learned the routes instinctively, navigating safe ground without prompting. Once, when Caleb misjudged a step and the crust sagged beneath his boot, Rex barked sharply and shouldered him back before the ground gave way. Caleb swore, laughed once in relief, and marked the spot. But he trusted the dog without question. He always had. On the fourth day, the valley announced another presence before Caleb saw it. The sound of hooves came from the lower trail, measured and familiar. Tom Alvarez rode into view again, his horse a chestnut gelding with a broad blaze and a patient eye. The animal was older, its movements economical, the kind of horse that had learned to save itself for when it mattered. Tom dismounted and studied the shelter in progress, taking in the stonework and the channels with a professional squint. "You're not guessing," Tom said finally. "You're listening." Caleb wiped his hands on his jacket. "Ground tells you what it wants if you give it time." Tom nodded, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening. "That's how my father talked," he said, then waved the thought away. But he introduced the horse as Lobo, 10 years old, steady under pressure. Lobo flicked an ear toward Rex, then relaxed, unconcerned. Tom's gaze shifted back to Caleb. "I brought something," he said, and pulled a canvas sack from the saddle. He set it down and loosened the tie. Inside were potatoes, wrinkled but sound, and a handful of onion sets. "Extra from the cellar," he said. "Ground like this might take them." Caleb accepted the sack with a nod that carried more gratitude than words. Tom lingered a moment longer, then pointed toward the ridge. "County's been talking about remarking old claims," he said. "Paperwork. Might bring folks asking questions." He held Caleb's gaze, not warning so much as informing. "You don't have to answer them." "I won't," Caleb said. Tom mounted and rode off, Lobo's hooves fading into steam. The potatoes changed the math. Caleb cut a test bed into a warm patch downstream where the water had cooled, worked the soil loose and set the seed pieces with care. He planted the onions nearby, pressing them in gently, then covered the beds with a thin layer of earth and stone to hold heat overnight. He didn't expect miracles. He expected data. Still, when green shoots broke through days later, delicate and stubborn, something tightened behind his ribs. He marked the dates, measured growth, adjusted water flow. The valley responded. It wasn't long before another figure appeared, this one on foot. She came down the trail with a careful gait, boots worn and well-fitted, a pack cinched tight against a slim frame. Her hair was a pale brown pulled back into a practical knot, a few strands escaping to catch the light. Her face was narrow, now freckled across the nose, eyes a clear blue that took in details without hurry. She wore a weathered field jacket with patched elbows and gloves clipped to her belt. When she reached the edge of the bowl, she stopped and waited, hands visible, respect evident in the pause. "My name's Sarah Whitlock," she called. "I'm with the county survey office. I heard there was steam down here." Caleb approached to a safe distance. "There is," he said. He watched her stance, balanced, unthreatening. She wasn't here to stake a claim with a hammer. She was here to see. Sarah stepped closer, eyes tracking the channels, the stonework, the green shoots. She crouched and pressed her fingers to the soil, then withdrew them with a quiet intake of breath. "That's warmer than it should be," she said, not smiling. "Geothermal seep, most likely. Small, but persistent." She straightened and met his eyes. "You building something?" "A place to live," Caleb said. She nodded once. "County maps don't show active use," she said. "Old claims lapsed decades ago. That doesn't mean people won't ask." Her gaze softened. "I won't file anything today, not unless you want me to." Caleb considered her for a moment, then shook his head. "Not today." Sarah accepted that without offense. I'll note the seep exists, she said. No coordinates. She turned to leave, then paused. Storms will keep coming, she added. But this place, she gestured to the bowl. It's rare. After she left, Caleb returned to his work with renewed focus. He closed in the shelter's opening with a framed door made from salvaged boards and fitted it tight. When night fell, the interior held warmth like a promise. He sat on the stone floor with Rex at his side, steam whispering beyond the walls, and felt something settle into place. Not safety, commitment. He closed the notebook on the day's final entry and wrote one line beneath it, simple and unadorned. Foundation set. Food started, attention coming. Caleb woke to a different quality of sound, a steadiness that told him the shelter had begun to behave like a place rather than a project. The air inside held its warmth evenly now, no sharp edges, no cold pockets tugging at his ankles. Steam whispered beyond the stone wall, and the door he'd framed sat flush in its opening, the wood swelling just enough in the heat to seal itself. Rex lifted his head when Caleb moved, tail thumping once against the floor, then settled again. The dog was 9, joints stiff in the mornings, but the stiffness eased quickly in the bowl's constant warmth. Caleb made a note of it without writing anything down. If Rex thrived here, the place worked. He spent the first hours of daylight on water. The stream had become the spine of everything, and Caleb treated it accordingly, laying flat stones to guide its flow, widening the channel where he wanted heat to dissipate, narrowing it where he needed temperature to hold. He cut shallow grooves into the rock with patient taps of the hammer, not forcing the water, only persuading it. Each change was tested and retested, measured by touch and time. He was building a system, not a trick. By mid-morning, he turned to the plants. The potato shoots had strengthened, leaves darkening, stems thickening in response to steady warmth and mineral-rich soil. The onions stood upright and earnest, thin green spears that promised more than they delivered, for now. Caleb extended the bed by a few feet, mixing in composted debris from the valley edge and leaf mold gathered from beneath the pines where heat reached just enough to keep decay moving through winter. He worked without hurry, aware of his body but not governed by it. This was the kind of labor that healed by repetition. Rex tracked his progress, occasionally veering off to patrol the warm margins, nose to the ground, checking for the scent of animals drawn by heat. The mule deer did not return that day, but birds did. Sparrows first, then a pair of juncos that flitted in and out of the steam with reckless confidence. Caleb watched them with quiet interest. Life noticed patterns faster than people. The afternoon brought visitors of a different kind. The sound of an engine cut across the valley's hush, distant but unmistakable, then resolved into a county truck easing along the lower trail. It stopped short of the bowl. 2 men stepped out and stood for a moment, hats pulled low, hands on hips. They did not approach immediately. That told Caleb something. He wiped his hands and waited near the door, posture open, Rex at his side. The first man was built square, shoulders broad beneath a heavy jacket, beard trimmed close and shot through with gray. His eyes were dark and steady, the kind that measured before speaking. The second was thinner, younger, with a clean-shaven face and a restless energy that showed in the way he shifted his weight. They introduced themselves without flourish. Mark Hensley, County Code Enforcement, Evan Price, Public Lands Liaison. Their voices were polite, professional. They looked at the steam, the stonework, the green shoots. "We got a note from Survey," Hensley said, nodding toward the ground. "Said there's geothermal activity here." "There is," Caleb replied. Price glanced at Rex, then back at Caleb. "We're not here to shut anything down," he said quickly, as if eager to establish tone. "Just to understand what's happening." Caleb gestured toward the channel and the beds. "I'm building a place to live," he said, "using what's here. I'm not diverting water off-site. I'm not fencing public access." Hensley crouched and pressed his hand to the soil, withdrawing it slowly. "Warm," he said. He stood and met Caleb's gaze. "You know this brings attention." "I do," Caleb said. There was a pause, the kind where decisions get made quietly. Hensley looked to Price, then back to Caleb. "There are processes," he said. "Permits, assessments, they take time." "I have time," Caleb said. It wasn't a challenge, it was a statement. Hensley nodded once. "We'll file that there's activity and a temporary structure," he said. "No action today." He hesitated, then added, "Keep it safe." They left without more, the engine fading back into the trees. Caleb watched until the sound disappeared, then turned back to his work. Attention had arrived, just as he'd written. It hadn't taken anything yet. In the days that followed, he expanded carefully. He built a low frame over a warm pool downstream and stretched salvaged plastic across it, anchoring the edges with stone. The result was a crude greenhouse, but effective. Heat rose from below, humidity gathered naturally, and light filtered through in a way that softened shadows without starving the plants. He planted cuttings and seeds he'd saved from a town visit weeks earlier. Tomatoes, peppers, herbs hardy enough to forgive mistakes. He documented everything: planting depth, water temperature, growth rate. This was no longer survival. It was practice. Tom Alvarez returned once, riding Lobo down to the bowl with a sack of feed and a look that suggested curiosity had finally outweighed caution. He walked the greenhouse frame, testing its stability, then nodded. "Smart," he said simply. "You thinking long term?" Caleb shrugged. "I'm thinking next winter." Tom smiled at that, brief and genuine. "That's long term enough." One evening, as the light drained from the sky, Sarah Whitlock appeared again, this time without a pack, notebook tucked under her arm. She walked the perimeter with a professional eye, asked precise questions, took notes without prying. When she paused at the greenhouse and watched condensation bead and slide down the plastic, her expression shifted from assessment to interest. "You've created a microclimate," she said. "It's stable," Caleb nodded. "So far." She closed her notebook. "If you're willing," she said, "I can help you document it properly, not to give it away, to protect it." She met his gaze. "Paperwork can be a shield." He considered her words longer than he needed to. "All right," he said finally, "but slow." She smiled then, not wide, but sincere. "Slow works," she said. The system grew more complex by degrees. Caleb built a bench along the shelter wall where heat pooled, using it to dry wood and keep tools from rusting. He ran a narrow channel beneath the stone floor to bleed warmth evenly, testing with bare feet until the balance felt right. He trained Rex to avoid marked danger zones, reinforcing paths with scent and routine. The dog adapted quickly, the work giving him purpose beyond watchfulness. By the end of the month, the greenhouse held green where the surrounding forest still slept under snow. Tomatoes climbed strings tied to the frame, leaves broad and confident, peppers flowered, herbs filled the air with sharp living scents. Caleb harvested sparingly, eating what he needed and leaving the rest to grow. He shared a small basket with Tom once, watching the older man's eyebrows lift in surprise at the taste. "This ground's got something to say," Tom said. "You're listening." On a clear evening, Caleb stood at the edge of the bowl and watched steam lift into the cooling air. Lights from the shelter glowed softly behind him, a small, deliberate warmth in a wide, cold world. He thought of systems again, not the ones that had failed him, but the kind built from observation and patience. The shape of this one was taking hold. He turned back toward the door, Rex rising to follow, and closed it gently, sealing the heat inside. Spring did not arrive in the bowl the way it did elsewhere. There was no sudden melt, no dramatic shift from white to green. Instead, winter loosened its grip in increments so small they could only be measured by attention. Snow retreated a hand's breadth at a time along the warm margins, exposing soil that breathed steam like a living lung. The days lengthened, light lingering in the hollow longer each evening, and the greenhouse responded first, leaves stretching wider, stems thickening as if the plants themselves sensed the changing balance. Caleb adjusted the system rather than expanding it. He narrowed channels that had been generous through winter, allowing heat to concentrate where new growth demanded it. He raised shade cloth inside the greenhouse to prevent scorching, rigging it with cord and scrap so it could be rolled back when clouds passed. The work was quieter now, less about survival and more about refinement. He noticed it in himself too. His movements had lost their edge. He still scanned, still planned exits, but the constant readiness had softened into something closer to vigilance without fear. Rex aged visibly as the season turned. The stiffness in his hips returned in the cool mornings, easing by noon, and Caleb modified routines to match. He laid flat stones along the dog's favored paths, so heat pooled underfoot. He raised Rex's sleeping platform by a few inches and lined it with wool scavenged from a discarded blanket, keeping joints warm through the night. Rex accepted the changes without fuss, eyes still bright, appetite steady. Then he spent more time lying where he could watch the whole bowl at once, sentinel by habit, guardian by choice. Attention increased as the snow line climbed the ridges. Hikers appeared on distant trails, their voices carrying faintly in the thin air. Once, a pair wandered too close, curiosity tugged by steam, and Caleb stepped out to meet them before they reached the marked ground. He spoke calmly, gave them a reason to turn back that didn't invite argument, and watched until they left. The system held. The boundaries worked. Sarah Whitlock returned with a different energy, her notebook thicker, boots dusted with red clay from another site. She spent hours measuring soil temperatures, humidity levels, airflow. Her questions were precise, respectful. She never asked why he'd chosen this life. She asked how it worked. Now that difference mattered. She sketched diagrams that mirrored Caleb's own, translating intuition into language that could survive scrutiny. When she spoke about reports and buffers and designations, she framed them as armor rather than chains. Documentation creates context, she said one afternoon, sitting on a warm stone with her jacket open, steam lifting past her shoulders. Context keeps people from filling gaps with assumptions. Caleb nodded. He understood systems. He had lived inside them long enough to know which parts cut and which parts protected. The first real test of spring came with water. Melt from higher slopes fed the stream, swelling it beyond winter's careful balance. Caleb watched levels rise, tested flow rates, and diverted excess into a spill channel he'd cut weeks earlier in anticipation. And the channel worked until it didn't. A late afternoon surge overwhelmed the stones, water slipping where it shouldn't, heat bleeding off too quickly in one corner of the greenhouse. Caleb reacted without panic, hauling rock, redirecting flow, working until his hands shook with fatigue. Rex stayed close, alert, shifting when told, once bracing his shoulder against a stone to keep it from sliding. By dusk, the system stabilized. Caleb sat back on his heels, chest heaving, and laughed once, sharp and surprised. He had misjudged and corrected. The place had forgiven him. That evening brought a visitor he did not expect. The sound of hooves came again, but not Tom's measured cadence. This was faster, lighter. A younger man rode into the bowl on a dark bay horse, reins loose, posture relaxed to the point of carelessness. But he dismounted with an easy grace and took in the scene with open curiosity. "Name's Luke Merritt," he said, smiling. He was in his late 20s, tall and lean, hair sun-bleached at the tips, jaw clean-shaven except for a narrow line of stubble that traced his chin. His eyes were quick, assessing without malice. "Tom sent me. Said there was something here worth seeing." Caleb watched him closely. Luke's confidence read as enthusiasm rather than entitlement, but enthusiasm could be dangerous in places like this. "There is," Caleb said, "and there are rules." Luke raised his hands in mock surrender. "Fair," he said. He glanced at the greenhouse, the channels, the shelter. "I grew up helping my grandfather with orchards down south. I know what heat can do when you don't respect it." He kicked at a stone gently, testing firmness. "I won't step where I'm not invited." They talked as the light faded, Luke asking questions that edged toward possibility. He spoke of markets in town, of chefs who paid for novelty, of the way a story could carry produce farther than a truck. Caleb listened without committing. He had heard versions of this before, always ending with expansion that demanded surrender. Luke sensed the resistance and adjusted, his tone shifting. "I'm not here to push," he said, "just to learn, maybe help if you want it." Caleb nodded once. "Learning's fine," he said. "Helping takes time." Luke accepted that, mounting again as night fell. "I'll be back," he said, not as a promise, but as a statement of intent. The next weeks were full. The greenhouse overflowed with growth, tomatoes setting fruit earlier than any calendar would approve. The peppers blushed green to red. Herbs thickened, their scents weaving together in a way that made the air feel alive. Caleb harvested carefully, keeping records, sharing selectively. Tom received another basket, Sarah took samples for analysis. Luke returned twice, each time staying at the edges, watching, offering labor without asking for stake. His horse, a 5-year-old bay named Finch, proved sure-footed and calm, learning quickly where steam softened ground. Rex watched both horse and rider with measured tolerance. One afternoon, as clouds stacked over the ridge again, Sarah arrived with news. She stood near the shelter door, posture serious. "There's talk," she said. "Nothing formal yet. Interest draws interest." Caleb met her gaze. "I know." She hesitated, then continued. "I can file for a temporary research designation. It won't stop everything, but it buys time." Caleb considered the greenhouse, the channels, Rex dozing in the warmth. Time mattered. "Do it," he said. The designation changed the tone of visits. Curiosity shifted to caution. People asked permission. The bowl remained quiet. Luke adapted, bringing soil amendments and helping reinforce the spill channel. He spoke less of markets, more of logistics, transport that didn't disrupt, distribution that stayed small. Caleb tested him with silence and labor. Luke stayed. By late spring, the bowl no longer felt like an experiment. It felt like a place with memory. Paths hardened under repeated steps. The shelter held cool on hot days and warmth when clouds blotted the sun. Rex slept deeper, content. Caleb stood one evening at the edge of the bowl and watched steam rise into air that no longer bit. Winter had let go, not completely, but enough. He returned inside as dusk settled, closing the door with care. The system hummed softly, water moving where it should, heat doing its patient work. Outside, the mountains held their snow. Inside, life grew. Caleb sat, wrote a final note for the day, and set the pencil down. The next phase would demand choices beyond stone and water. He felt ready to make them. Summer announced itself with heat that lingered after sunset, the kind that pressed softly against the skin and made decisions feel heavier. The bowl held steady, steam thinning to a translucent veil during the day and returning at night with quiet insistence. Caleb adjusted schedules rather than structures, harvesting at dawn, working the channels before noon, retreating to shade when the sun climbed high enough to demand it. The system he'd built responded to care now, not force, and that shift carried through everything else. Rex slowed in the afternoons, the dog's coat dull to shade, his muzzle whitening further, but his eyes stayed sharp. Caleb learned the new signs, how Rex favored one hip when the day was long, how he chose stone warmed just enough to ease joints without baking them. Caleb adapted without ceremony, moving tasks to cooler hours, shortening patrols, trusting the boundaries they'd set together. He talked to Rex more than he had before, narrating work, letting the sound of his voice settle the dog. It wasn't sentimentality. It was acknowledgement. Luke Merritt returned with a different posture, less buoyant, more deliberate. He dismounted at the edge of the bowl and waited, hands loose at his sides, Finch cropping at grass that shouldn't have been there yet. Luke's clothes bore the marks of work now, dust ground into seams, a tear repaired with neat stitches along the knee. He had learned the rhythm of the place enough to respect it. "I've been thinking," Luke said when Caleb joined him, "about scale." Caleb watched steam lift and dissipate. "So have I." Luke nodded, relief flickering across his face. "I'm not talking big," he said quickly. "Small shipments, seasonal. Chefs who want consistency, not volume. We keep the bowl first." They walked the greenhouse together, Luke careful where he stepped, asking before touching. He tasted a tomato offered without flourish and closed his eyes briefly, surprised. "This is different," he said. "Mineral, clean." Caleb met his gaze. Different means attention. Luke didn't argue. "It also means leverage," he said quietly. "The right kind." The next day brought a visitor who carried authority like a tailored coat. She arrived in a county sedan that stopped short of the bowl, her heels sensible, her posture precise. She introduced herself as Dana Coulter, regional planning consultant. Mid-40s, tall, hair silvering at the temples. The face composed into a professional neutrality that suggested long practice. Her eyes were sharp but not unkind. She took in the steam, the greenhouse, the shelter, and the marked paths with the efficiency of someone trained to see systems. "I'm not here to shut you down," Dana said, voice even. "I'm here because everyone else keeps asking me what to do with you." Caleb appreciated the candor. I'm not a problem to be solved, he said. Dana smiled faintly. That depends on who's asking, she said. But you've done something unusual without breaking rules. That complicates things. She gestured to the bowl. There are ways to formalize this that don't hollow it out. They spoke for hours, circling the same questions from different angles. Dana outlined options, special use permits, cooperative agreements. She researched overlays without pushing any single outcome. She listened when Caleb spoke about limits, about control, about the difference between growth and extraction. She asked about Rex, about Luke's involvement, about Sarah's documentation. When she left, she did so without promises, only a card placed carefully on a warm stone. The pressure built anyway. A photographer arrived unannounced and left quickly when asked, but not before a lens caught steam against green. A blog post followed, then a call Luke intercepted and deflected. Caleb felt the old tightening return, the instinct to retreat, to reduce visibility until the world moved on. He considered it seriously, walking the bowl late one night, steam beating on his jacket, Rex pacing beside him. It was Sarah who reframed the question. She arrived with printouts and a look that mixed excitement with concern. Visibility isn't the enemy, she said. Unmanaged visibility is. She pointed to data, to timelines, to the way attention spiked and faded. If you say yes on your terms, you can say no to everything else. Caleb sat with that through a long afternoon, hands resting on warm stone, listening to water move. He thought about systems again, how they failed when they denied reality, how they endured when they accounted for it. He thought about Rex aging, about winter returning, about what would happen if he were injured or sick. He thought about Luke's steady presence, Sarah's careful armor, Tom's quiet support. He thought about Dana's card. He called a meeting. They gathered in the bowl at dusk, steam softening edges. Tom arrived first on Lobo, hat tipped back, the face weathered into a cautious smile. Sarah came next, notebook tucked away for once, jacket unzipped. Luke followed with Finch, tying the horse where ground stayed firm. Dana arrived last, heels traded for boots, posture still precise. Rex lay at Caleb's feet, eyes half closed but attentive. Caleb spoke plainly. He outlined a proposal that surprised even him with its clarity. Limited production tied to seasons, cooperative distribution through Luke's contacts, research documentation led by Sarah, a formal agreement shaped with Dana's guidance that preserved control and restricted expansion, a contingency plan for care and continuity that acknowledged Rex's age and Caleb's own limits. No investors, no scaling beyond what the bowl could hold, a yes that contained its own no. Silence followed, the kind that weighs ideas. Tom nodded first. Sounds like you're keeping the ground first, he said. That's right. Sarah smiled, relief evident. This protects the work, she said, and the place. Luke exhaled slowly. I can make this work, he said, small, honest. Dana met Caleb's gaze. This is defensible, she said, and rare. Caleb felt the tension ease, not disappear, but settle into something he could carry. He looked down at Rex, who lifted his head and met his eyes. The dog's tail thumped once, approval without ceremony. They sealed it without contracts that night, only with intent. Contracts would come. Tonight was for alignment. They shared a simple meal, produce and bread, coffee poured carefully. Laughter rose and fell, tentative but real. The bowl held it all, steam drifting upward as the sky darkened. Later, after the others left, Caleb walked the perimeter again. He tested channels, checked anchors, noted where summer had altered balance. He returned to the shelter and sat with Rex, hand resting on the dog's neck. We said yes, he said softly. Rex sighed and settled, warmth pressing back. Caleb wrote late, not notes this time, but commitments, the shape of responsibility taking form. When he finished, he closed the book and set it aside. The weight of yes sat heavy, but it was the right weight, the kind that strengthened rather than bent. Autumn returned to the bowl the way it always had, quietly, without ceremony. But this year it carried weight. The air cooled at night, sharp enough to remind the mountains what season it was, while the valley answered with steady breath. Steam rose more faithfully now, as if the ground itself understood responsibility. Caleb adjusted routines rather than structures, shortening days, lengthening checks, listening for the subtle shifts that signaled winter's approach. The system had matured to the point where it no longer needed proving. It needed tending. Rex crossed the threshold into his 10th year, sometime between the first yellowing leaves and the first frost on the ridge. His muzzle had gone mostly white now, the black mask softened into gray, but his eyes remained clear and attentive. He moved more slowly, choosing his steps with care, and Caleb adapted again, lower ramps, wider paths, longer rests. Rex slept closer to the shelter's warmest wall, rising only when necessary, dignity intact. He no longer patrolled the perimeter, he supervised it. Caleb found himself pausing more often to rest a hand on the dog's back, feeling the steady warmth there, grounding himself in what remained constant. The agreement they had shaped took form on paper without changing its spirit. Dana Coulter handled the language with precision, carving out protections that prioritized stewardship over output. Sarah's documentation anchored claims in data, not sentiment. Luke coordinated distribution so quietly it felt almost invisible. Small shipments, irregular schedules, no branding beyond origin and honesty. Tom Alvarez became an unofficial gatekeeper, like redirecting curiosity with a word or a look. The bowl remained what it had always been, a place first, an enterprise second. The first winter under the agreement tested everything at once. Storms came earlier and lingered longer, stacking snow deep beyond the warm margins. Meltwater surged and receded in cycles that demanded constant attention. Caleb worked through it with a calm that surprised him, solving problems before they escalated, trusting the system and his own judgment in equal measure. The greenhouse thrived, leaves pressing against plastic while the world beyond froze solid. Harvests were modest and precise. Nothing was wasted. One night, after a long day of clearing channels and reinforcing anchors, Caleb sat alone with Rex as snow fell thick and soundless. He spoke aloud without realizing it, while telling the dog about small victories and near misses, about the way the system had responded when pushed. Rex listened, head resting on paws, eyes half-lidded. When Caleb fell silent, Rex lifted his head and nudged his hand once, a reminder not to drift too far inward. Caleb smiled and stayed where he was. Spring came again, gentler this time. The bowl felt seasoned, less reactive, more assured. The first visitors under the agreement arrived by invitation, researchers who asked before stepping, who followed paths without being told, who treated the steam with respect. Caleb watched from a distance, present but not central. He had learned when to lead and when to let the work speak for itself. Rex's health declined gradually, without drama. His appetite waned, then returned, then waned again. He slept more, woke slower. Caleb noticed everything and said little. On a clear morning with frost sparkling beyond the bowl, Rex did not rise at all. He lay where he had chosen, on warm stone near the shelter wall, breathing shallowly, eyes still clear. Caleb knelt beside him and spoke softly, hands steady, voice calm. Rex's tail thumped once, then stilled. He went without struggle, the warmth holding him as it always had. They buried Rex at the edge of the bowl where heat met earth, beneath a stone marked only with his name. Caleb stood there longer than he needed to, feeling the absence settle into the shape of the place. Grief arrived cleanly, without chaos, and stayed. He did not push it away. He let it be part of the system. Life continued, altered but intact. Luke took on more physical work, anticipating Caleb's needs without prompting. Sarah expanded the research scope, mentoring students who arrived with humility. Dana checked in periodically, her visits shorter now, her tone lighter. Tom brought apples from his orchard one fall, bruised and sweet, and stayed for coffee. The bowl absorbed it all, unchanged at its core. Years passed in measured layers. Caleb aged into the work, his hair thinning, his shoulders rounding slightly, his hands growing stronger in their certainty even as speed fell away. He taught when asked and stepped back when not. The greenhouse cycled through countless seasons, each one reinforcing what the first had promised. The valley fed people quietly, consistently, without spectacle. On an evening that felt ordinary in the best way, Caleb stood at the bowl's edge and watched steam rise into a sky streaked with color. The children laughed somewhere near the shelter, Sarah's students, Tom's grandchildren, Luke's nieces, voices bright against the hush. The place no longer depended on him alone. That realization brought a peace he had not known to expect. Caleb returned inside and opened his old notebook, the first one he'd carried into the mountains. He read the early entries, measurements, warnings, questions, and smiled at their urgency. On the last page, he wrote a final line, simple and complete. The ground kept its promise. So did we. He closed the book and set it on the shelf beside tools worn smooth by use. Outside, winter waited beyond the ridges. Inside, warmth held. The bowl breathed steadily, a place that had chosen him back, and in doing so, taught him how to stay. Sometimes miracles don't arrive as thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes they rise quietly, like warmth from frozen ground, waiting for someone patient enough to notice. Caleb didn't create the heat beneath the valley. He didn't command the earth to stay warm when winter returned. That gift was already there, placed long before him, long before any map or rule or failure in his life. What he did was recognize it. If you believe in God, you might call that warmth a blessing. If you don't, you might call it chance or nature. But either way, the truth remains the same. Provision often exists before we understand it, and help sometimes appears only after we stop running from silence and start listening. In everyday life, we all walk past our own columns of steam, opportunities we dismiss because they look strange, risky, foul, or different from what we were taught to expect. Places where God may already be working, quietly, while we're too busy waiting for something louder. This story isn't really about a man, a dog, or a warm valley. It's about faith that shows up as effort, hope that looks like persistence, and miracles that don't break the laws of nature, they simply reveal them at the right moment. If this story spoke to you, take a moment to reflect on your own life. What warmth is already there, even if everything around it feels cold? What gift might God have placed in your path, waiting for you to recognize it? If you felt something while watching or reading this, please share it with someone who might need it today. Leave a comment, we read everyone. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel for more stories about quiet strength, on second chances, and ordinary people who discover extraordinary grace. May God bless you, protect you, and guide your steps, especially in seasons when the world feels frozen. You are not forgotten.